Hey, this is the story of my great-great-grandfather, Jackson Rawlin Hezekiah Grant. Let me share with you how this picture came to being. It was Mama who described him. My mama would sit down and she would talk to me about the history of my family. And I'm telling you, I really learned a lot because I wanted to know about my past. I wanted to know about my history. So of course I went down to South Carolina, where my mother came from, and I went to basically the library. And when I went to the library, I wanted to find out about my grandfather, okay? But there was no Ancestry.com that can teach me, or a library like my mother could. This is her grandfather, Jackson Rawlin Hezekiah Grant. Now I want you to study the picture because it was the image that my mother gave me that allowed me to do this. Now first I drew it. I drew it with a pencil. I drew it on a piece of cardboard, and I wanted to show the reality of a sharecropper. Now look at the blue. I mean, that's the sky. I just cut out pieces of paper and made a sky out of it. Okay? I took the lights, I took the darks, and I started to make sky. Okay? Now, after that, I took out the browns and I started to put the brown together to fit in my horse. Now, this is basically a mosaic. Okay? Now, they had said that I had created a new art form, and that's painting with paper. But you got to understand, I couldn't afford oil paint, so what did I do? I went and I got old magazines, old posters, and I just cut out colors and put them in large jars. So of course I had my brown jar, I had my blue jar, I had my green jar, I had my beige jar. I had all these different colors, and I started to fit them in the actual drawing that I did. Okay? And I wanted it to take on a life of its own. And in taking on a life of its own, it took months of me making mistakes because my best pictures came out of my mistakes. I wanted his shirt to look wrinkly. I wanted to let you know that this man had worked that field. Of course, you got to understand the story because my mother told me the story, and the story was in me while I was putting the pieces of paper together. She said that her great-grandfather, Jackson Rawlin Hezekiah Grant, was a slave. And his father taught him the no quit and the hard work because they worked the cotton fields for the slave master. But in South Carolina, they had a thing where they only worked the slaves 8 hours. And from then, the slaves can go home or they can work another man's field. So they would go from the cotton field to the rice field. And they would work the rice field, and on the rice field, they got paid ducats. You see, as a slave, they worked the 8 hours and they didn't get paid nothing. Okay? However, when they worked the rice field, they got paid ducats. I'm sorry. That's dollars. I'm just going, sometimes you got to excuse me. I'm from the projects, so I go project on you. But anyway, they were making some money. And then the Emancipation Proclamation came, and they were free. So of course, Jackson took himself a job as a sharecropper, working for the same slave master, basically. And the slave master beat him at every turn. When he went to buy supplies, the slave master overpriced him. He was just beaten down, but he wouldn't quit because that was what Mama taught me. She said there was no quit in well, in my great-great-grandfather. But let me just say there was no quit in her grandfather. He worked and worked and worked, okay? And he was able to buy him a plot of land. Now, of course, they sold him land that was nothing but dirt, but it was on this earth, and he just made that earth come alive because that's the way soil is. It's part of the life. It's part of our life, okay? I mean, when we go to scripture, it says, remember, man, that thou art dust, and unto dust thou shalt return. So the soil was alive, and Jackson wanted to make it fruitful. So he plowed and plowed and plowed. And they would say this one little thing about Jackson. They said, Jackson Brawl and Roll and Hezekiah Grant didn't care if the mule went blind. He was going to toe the line. And that's what he did. He worked. And as I drew him, I said to myself, Mama, you gave me the strength in my spirit. And of course, I was thin like Jackson Brawl and Roll and Hezekiah Grant, but there was a strength in me. And I got this from my grandfather. Now, Mama taught me another thing about him, was his spirit. Now, Jackson wouldn't back down from any fight. Okay, he fought anyone that confronted him. And of course, he was confronted. However, to the white man, Jackson would bow. Jackson would cross the street. If he saw a white woman, he never raised his eyes. He went on, and of course, you might not understand this, but it was a new kind of slavery going on. And Jackson had to let the white man know that he was humbling himself and that the white man was superior to him. And that was Jackson's way. But Jackson had another hidden agenda. You see, you got to understand this. The white man thought he was better because he was white. Not many of the white men in South Carolina own large plantations. They might own one slave or two, but they thought they were better because of their white skin. Now, some of them was going through rough times, okay? And it was hard for them to eat, but they were still better because they were white, according to them. Now, Jackson took that knowledge of their hatred and he used it against them. He played the slave. I mean, he humbled himself, bowed down, and took his hat off. Yes, boss, no, boss. That was his language. But Jackson was smart, okay? Because Mama said Jackson taught his family, you gotta lick before you can kick. And that's what Mama was teaching me. And I was saying, but Mama, you don't understand. This is the civil rights movement. We're going to change the system. We're going to make a difference. Mama, this is a new day. Forget about slavery. But Mama was right. When Mama said, you can't fight City Hall, I didn't understand what she was saying. She just kept on saying, you got to lick before you can kick. Now, Jackson drawn this down, but at the same time, you got to understand Jackson's better half. Jackson married himself a woman named Jane. Now, Jane can pass for white, and Jane's story is a horrible story because Jane's father was Mr. Fishburne, and Mr. Fishburne was one of the richest men in South Carolina. Okay? James' father owned a bank in South Carolina, and he was a powerhouse in South Carolina. However, he loved the sex from James' mother, Mary. Okay? Mary was a slave. And during that time, a white man can do whatever he wanted sexually to a black woman. In fact, he can do whatever he wanted sexually to a black man. But it was Mary that Fishburne wanted. Now, he had a wife and he had children. And from that relationship, he had a daughter. And her name was Jane. And Jane was given all the hand-me-down. Okay? However, you might say Mr. Fishburne broke the law because he taught Jane how to read and write. And that was against the law in South Carolina. To teach a slave how to read and write. Now, he loved Jane. And he tried to let Jane know how much he loved her. However, he still wouldn't give Jane his last name. He gave his last name to his white children. And of course, years and years later, after he had passed, my family told me that in school, the Fishburnes went there too because they had integrated the school. And they would let them know, we know we're related by blood, but you're not related by economics. So the Fishburnes were rich and their descendants became rich. But let me go back to Jane. Jane did not want anything from Mr. Fishburne. He couldn't give her nothing. And she married one of the darkest Africans in South Carolina. He was dark chocolate. And that was my great-great-grandfather, Jackson Brawl and Hezekiah Green. They married and they had children. And her youngest son was named James. And of course, she educated all her children. They all could read and write. In fact, my grandmother, Emma, was one of the first black women to graduate from Allen University. Okay? So, Jane taught her children well. But she taught the spirit that you are somebody in her youngest son, Benny. Benny actually believed that he was a human being. So, when he was abused by this particular white man, Benny didn't go for it. Benny fought him and beat him down. Now that's a no-no in South Carolina. And you know whites weren't having that because you got to understand, South Carolina was the largest, when I say largest, you got to understand population of blacks in comparison to whites. There were more blacks in South Carolina than there were whites. Well, that's basically because of the slave ships with docked in South Carolina. Okay? And that's where the slaves were sold from. Slaves were sold and brought up north. I mean, when I say north, I'm talking about the North Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, and all the other places. But the ships landed in South Carolina. So, you got to understand that this population was a black dominating population. So the whites had to be extra hard on the blacks in South Carolina to keep them in check. Okay? So the abuse was unbelievable. I mean, South Carolina went so far as uh, when the Civil War came about, South Carolina was the first to secede from the Union. They wanted to be a part of this new nation that kept slaves. So South Carolina had its history, and it was a damn tough, rough, hard history on black folks. So Jane had a son. His name was Benny. Benny went against all the rules in standing up to a white man. A white mob gathered. They didn't even put on their hoods. They came straight up to Jackson, Rawlins, Hezekiah Grant Lane and said, we want Benny. They said, now, Jackson, you're a good nigga. And they said Jackson was a good nigga because Jackson always showed the white man total respect and humbled himself. And we want you to turn your boy over to us. Now, Jackson knew they were going to lynch Benny, okay? There would be no trial for Benny. And Jackson nodded his head, and they believed Jackson. Because again, like I tried to tell you, the black man could fool the white man, but the white man couldn't fool the black man because the black man knew that the white man hated him. But the black man can act like he loved Boss, and he would go along with Boss, and he would do anything for Boss, even turn his own child over to be killed. Okay? Well, Jackson told him he didn't know where Benny was because he didn't come there. So the mob searched Jackson's land from top to bottom. I mean, there wasn't nothing that they didn't search. They even went under the rocks to find Benny, but they couldn't find him. So night came. And of course, Jackson had hid Benny, and he took Benny down to the jig joint section in South Carolina. Now, the jig joint section was where the blues was developed. Okay? It was where jazz came out. Because they sang their broke songs, okay, about how their world was no good. And they didn't give much of a hoot for the white man. And they let the white man know in so many ways. Okay, if you're talking about chickens being stolen, it was those black folks down at the jig joint. Now, of course, the white man called all the blacks niggers, but these were the worst kind of niggers, okay, as they saw it. Well, Jackson had heard about this black man named Dumb Roscoe. Now, Dumb Roscoe is what we might call today a retard, okay? Because Dumb Roscoe, you never understood a single word he was saying, okay? And Dumb Roscoe would talk to you and start mumbling and dribbling from his bottom lip, and you would just walk away. Whites walked away from him, even blacks, because Dumb Roscoe didn't make any sense out of anything. You never understood a single word he was saying, okay? However, Dumb Roscoe was in business. Dumb Roscoe had a horse and buggy. And inside his buggy was a little cabin where a human body could hide. And Dumb Roscoe would smuggle blacks out of South Carolina. And that's where Benny went, into that little compartment in Dumb Roscoe's buggy. And of course, Jackson paid him. And Dumb Roscoe marched out of South Carolina with his horse. I mean, he wasn't on the horse. He was just walking his horse, walking through. They wouldn't even stop him. White said that Dumb Roscoe wasn't worth a curse. He was just useless. And of course, they had things out in South Carolina where they would make sure that they kept the blacks there because they needed the labor after slavery. But Roscoe, he wasn't worth a curse. And of course, as I try to tell you, today Roscoe would be called a retard. Okay? So he went out of South Carolina with them. Now, as strong as Jackson, Rawlins, Grant was, he had to go home and face Jane. And Jane loved Benny. Benny was her baby boy. Now, you might say that, and mothers will say, oh, I love all my children the same. But Jackson, Rawlins, Grant, and all his children knew that Jane loved Benny more than any of them. Okay? Jackson had to answer all her questions. And she had a number of questions. Where were they going? Did he have something to eat? Was he scared? Did they catch him? I mean, she went on, and poor Jackson, he couldn't answer all her questions. Not to her satisfaction. And time passed. She didn't get a letter from Benny because the whites controlled the mail. And of course, they would open up the mail and they would read. Okay? And they were especially interested in slaves that had disappeared. So they would check those envelopes extra sharp. Open up the mail, cut it open, tear the letter up. They wanted to make sure that if they found Benny, they were going to lynch him. Okay? Because Benny had escaped the lynching tree. Okay? And years passed. I mean, every time Jane went down to the store with her husband to pick up farm equipment, Jane was so angry and hated whites so, even though she was the daughter of a white man, she would eyeball them. She didn't care. But at the same time, people thought she was losing her mind because she stopped speaking. She went inside herself. She couldn't talk no more. So she was mute. And people worried about her. They wondered about her. And years kept going by. And eventually, Jane was on her deathbed. And just at that time, guess who knocks on the door? Dumb Roscoe. Roscoe wanted to talk to Jane. And they were all amazed because Roscoe wasn't dribbling from his mouth. And Roscoe was speaking intelligently, perfect English, it seemed like. And they were all shocked. And he told them, Benny educated him. He told them, Benny is in Florida. He also told them that Benny had 8 children. Jane was a grandma of 8 children. And he had the pictures to show Jane. Jane was overjoyed. Now, Jackson, Rawlins, Hezekiah Grant couldn't answer her questions, but dumb Roscoe could. He answered every question, even knew the names of her grandchildren, told her that Benny was down in Florida and he was teaching children how to read and write. Jane just about choked up. With tears in her eyes, Jane was full of joy. And Jane went on and on into the night, asking dumb Roscoe every kind of question possible. However, it was her time. And Jane left the planet peacefully, with joy on her face. And of course, it was poor Jackson Rawlins Grant who couldn't take it anymore. He had worked so hard. He had left so much land. And he had left the lesson of you gotta lick before you can kick. And it was up to his children to take that lesson on. And Jackson Rawlins Grant, Hezekiah Grant, might I say, left the planet. But the thing that puzzled me about this black man is that he couldn't read or write, and he knew the Bible from cover to cover. And in knowing the Bible, he left us with African Christianity. Okay? And when I say African Christianity, that's the strongest Christianity of them all. He believed that the good ship Jesus would free us as a people one day. He really believed that you had to lick before you can kick. He really believed that one day the black man would be free because of the Jesus that he served. Now, of course, you got to understand that Jackson was given the slave Bible. You got to understand that the slave Bible had said that we were condemned to have black skin because we looked upon Noah in his nudity, and of course we would be given woolly hair, thick lips, and elongated penis, etc., etc. They just put us down and said that we were to be ever enslaved to the white man, according to the Bible. Okay? But you know how they can trick up the Bible. But again, Jackson, Rawlins, Grant left his children a belief in Jesus that can free. And that Jesus went straight to my grandmother. Now, my grandmother, this was the Depression. My grandmother went to Mr. Fishburne to get money. Okay? I'm not talking about a loan. She went to get money from him to feed her family. Okay? And Mr. Fishburne, he loved his daughter Jane, even though Jane didn't take anything, and Jane had passed. But at the same time, he would give money to his granddaughter, my grandmother, Emma. And Emma was able to feed her family with the money that Mr. Fishburne gave. Now, I'm going to say this about Mr. Fishburne. Mr. Fishburne was kind of unbelievable because he owned a bank. And my cousin Nunu had ran into the bank. And when I say ran into the bank, she had a car accident, okay? And she went to the hospital. Do you know Mr. Fishburne paid for the hospital, and he paid basically for the damages. So she didn't have to pay anything. And I'm going to say this. His grandson, my Dennis Mitchell, okay, well, basically, Dennis told me Danny was his father. And Danny got a job working in the bank. And they left money there for Danny to steal. And Mr. Fishburne's grandson would not steal a dime. So he had a job. And Mr. Fishburne, he looked after our family even though his children didn't. Okay? So in order to understand the story of Jackson, Rawlins, Grant, you have to understand James. And that's what I'm trying to say, because that was my heritage. Now, of course, when I went to South Carolina, I went to one of the largest homes. Well, it was like a home that really took care of people that wanted a resort and stuff like that. It was owned by the Fishburne. I wanted to run in there because I was with my cousins. I wanted to run in there and say, "Your great-great-great-grandson is here," you know, and smile and do my Sammy Davis tap dance. And they grabbed me and said, "No, you won't. You're not going in there. Okay? You got to understand, we're in South Carolina. And in South Carolina, it's still one of the worst discriminatory places to be in. Okay? Now, I was amazed that my mother's uncle was the one that donated his land in Waldoboro, South Carolina, for them to open up an integrated school. Okay? That's the kind of family I came from. It was a giving family. That's why it's in my heart to give. But again, this picture took me out because I couldn't believe that he had worked that dirt for my family to accomplish the unbelievable. And when I say accomplish the unbelievable, my brother Armand, okay, he was a hard-working basketball player. They called him Army in there because he never quit. Okay, where did he get that never quit from? He got it from Jackson, Roll, and Hezekiah Grant. Look at Jackson, Roll, and Hezekiah Grant's body. That was a Mormon's body. Okay, my brother's name was Armand. Okay, and he had a thin body. He was 175 pounds and 6'5". Okay, we all are basically thin. Okay, and we got that from the genes that Jackson, Roll, and Hezekiah Grant gave us. But again, let's look at Emma. Armand graduated from Princeton University. Now, Emma got that education, gave it to Mama, but she got it from Jane. Okay? And now, look at my brother Barry. He graduated with a law degree from, you're not going to believe this, Cornell University. Okay? And he was one of the tops in his class. And he had never quit in him. I had never quit in me. I can talk about my sisters. I can talk about my sister Janice being who's doing America. We came from a family who was educated and there was no quit in our game. And that all goes back to this picture that my mother taught me about her grandfather. Okay? His toil, his sweat, his work in that field helped us to work in our field. And it was real in our field because we were in the hood. Okay? I mean, we all came out of the Fort Greene projects. The particular section was called Farragut. Okay? But we were determined, while so many was set up and destroyed, somehow our work ethics got us through. Okay? Now, as I was finishing up the picture, tears started to come to my eyes. I said, Lord, I can see the spirit of my grandfather. I said, wow, I could see him and what he did and how he did it. Okay? Now I understand because it was in us. We didn't care if the mule went blind. We were going to toe the line. And let me tell you, we worked. I'm telling you, I worked as a teacher. And it was hard work. And my students know that I put in my duty. Okay, I worked hard for them. I mean, but after that, I would go to the homeless shelter. And I would work all night at the shelter. Okay? And I would get up and I would feed the men. And it was like that because I didn't have no real support system. First, I hired two strong brothers. You know, they were Muslim brothers, and I figured that, you know, the community was afraid of the Muslims, so I would have them work for me. But they quit on me after the first night. You know, and I was paying $50 a night. They said, hey, listen, we can't deal with this mentally ill stuff because the men were mentally ill. Okay, at least most of them that were in there at the time when they were working. And they said, we could be here with Jack the Ripper. We're not staying here. So guess what? I had to become the security. I slept there at night. Okay? I was the one who was with them. And you know what? Maybe I'm a moron. But when they would walk, around me and talking to themselves and stuff like that, it didn't bother me. And when they woke up, I fed them. And they ate well.